So, welcome to our episode club. Today is May 26th, 2020, and we are going to be talking about Star Trek Voyager episode Relativity and the Deep Space Nine episode Children of Time. Both very good, both very intense. Hey, Charlie, thanks for hanging out. If you are watching us after the fact on YouTube, you will notice I now have flashy intros and outros. If you are here on Twitch, then you just saw my face appear and we start talking. But if you are here on Twitch, you might not get the fancy intros, but you are able to take part in the live chat. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Now, what we do here in this episode club, if it is your first time here, we talk about the science behind the episodes or the movies that we discuss. Hey, Mikhail. And if you are interested in taking part in that, voting on what we discuss or suggesting ideas, you can check out my Patreon at the About section down below, because it's a pretty great community, and I'm really lucky to be a key member of it. So, without further ado, we are going to be talking about first the Voyager episode Relativity, which is season 5, episode 24. So near the end of the 5th season, we've got 7 of 9 and cool stuff happening. And it opens on a shipyard dry docks. And for Voyager having been lost in the Delta Quadrant and continuing to be lost, it's a very happy, homey sight to see the dry docks. And we want to be there, we want to be home. But it's Utopia Planitia, which has been mentioned and seen a few times. We actually brought this up during Parallels, I think, the TNG episode, that we got to see a sort of spy reconnaissance image of Utopia Planitia, but now we got to see it when it was housing Voyager. And hey, Brad. Oh, yes. So many time jumps. This episode has so many time jumps for the viewer and the characters. They go through the ringer here. So, we see Voyager, our good Voyager. Janeway beams aboard. She gets greeted by her old professor, the Starfleet Academy, the admirals, and she's excited to be there, and it's all very relatable for me and adorable. And then 7 of 9 is sneaking around as a lower decks ensign. And that's the sort of dun-dun-dun, something's not right here. And she doesn't have a Borg implant, which is also something's not right here. and it's exciting and fun. She basically, they're throwing out a bunch of technobabble about Voyager itself as a ship, which is fabulous. They have to realign the EPS manifolds. It has a Class 9 warp drive with a tricyclic input manifolds, and it's its first time in deep space. That sucks. That probably put a little bit of a wrench in the development of the Intrepid class vehicles when the first one in deep space disappeared. And they don't know, at least for a while, didn't know what happened to it, so that sucks. But 7 is kind of crawling around. She detects these temporal distortions and has basically found a weapon on the ship. She tries to disarm it, but the weapon is out of phase. So that's indicating that 7 is in the wrong time frame. And this is going to be key for us throughout, because it's physically there, but she can't touch it because it's in the wrong time frame. They're both in the same time together, but whose time frame? Is it 7's? Is it the ship? Is it the bombs? We'll find out. Yeah. And it does actually make sense as we were going through it. And we will. The jumping back and forth, you're like, oh, that's so 7 already had to experience this before this, so that's how she can touch it now. And it's pretty awesome. They are picking up a chronoton flux of 0.003. Unitless values. And 0.003 chronoton flux, essentially. But that basically would assume, if it's flux and chronotons, that you have particles per second. So we have 0.003 particles per second, which would, oh gosh, I hate when I get myself to the point that I have to real-time math on this, but You know what? Why not? So 0.003 times 60, 0.18. So let's times 60 again. So about 10 particles per minute. No, 10 particles per hour. Got to the minutes and then the hour. 10 particles per hour. 10 chronoton particles per hour. So we got there eventually. And then if we want to do it by that, then yeah. We get there. I love it though. It's fabulous. So yeah, they're detecting this flux. Chronotons are a made-up particle that we assume is the fundamental time particle. This is not a physics thing, or as I like to call it, this is not a pre-Cochrane device. We in scientific community today does not have a fundamental particle for time. The Star Trek universe does, and it's called a chronoton. So we're happy to have that. And and I love it. But the 0.003 is going to keep coming back all throughout. That's the key to the time travel that's happening. Now, so 7 gets back. There's essentially some time travel. First of all, the 7 that was there collapses. Then they flash to our Voyager timeline, the sort of Stardate 52 something that we know and love and are happy with. About 5 years after, 5 years after the dry dock scene. 7 is starting to have physiological issues. She's getting double vision and realizes it's her human side that's not doing so hot. And I really love this scene because the doctor, like, she basically WebMD'd her symptoms and was like, I'm dying of all the things. And the doctor was like, you're not. That was a WebMD move and you should just come talk to me. And she's like, yeah, but you're also a database. And he's like, yeah, but I have an excellent bedside manner. And it's adorable and we love it. Then Tom Paris is playing ping pong because that's what they do. He has a freaking ping pong tournament and lures 7 to do it based on the ability to beat B'Elanna. So I like that little dynamic there. But everyone is starting to get sick with space sickness. So initially they think maybe the inertial dampeners are out of alignment. And this is something that we discussed in Dark Matter, actually, when we were talking about Dark Matter episodes, that one of the characters, sort of small character, was feeling nauseous and he said, I have, might be the inertial, they threw out the term inertial dampeners in Dark Matter. But just a quick recap of that is it's basically saying that your ship is going to go fast and slow down and the inertial dampeners will keep you from being turned into a pancake on the front or the back of your ship. And space sickness is a very specific thing. Now there's a lot, because there's only a small sample of astronauts that we can study this on. There's different sort of causes and effects and different things like this. But yeah, that they find that 50% of the astronauts experience it. Thank you, Andy. I appreciate this. And they haven't figured out exactly what causes it. They just know that that 50% of the astronauts from a small sample, right? So we have a small sample size. So don't take that as like every single person who goes into space, 50% of them are going to have space sickness. That's just because we have a small sample size, but we have a pretty decent sample size, and that's a high number. And there's various explanations to this. Part of it is kind of this just a perspective vertigo thing, that they think that as the International Space Station is basically falling around the Earth, that you're orbiting so fast and you can kind of see your motion around home. Whereas here on Earth, me sitting doing this, I'm not seeing motion. I'm not seeing the Earth orbit. I'm not seeing myself move around. So there's that. What happens if you start to constantly be aware of your motion? That's kind of one of the theories that comes at. Also being weightless, this idea that they are, as Andy pointed out, this motion sickness and the fluid sacks, the human fluid sacks that we are weightless, and our whole bodies are used to being in gravity. And so when our stomach, our blood, our brain fluid, everything is just up and floating around, that could cause some issues, as well as relative motion, right? I've talked about this a little bit now when we discuss artificial gravity as a rotating space station, that if you had a smaller radius, your motion around that space station would give you terrible vertigo, basically from Coriolis forces, that you're moving this way, but the blood is moving this way, and you're moving this way. And centrifugal force, you want to stay in a straight direction, and everything going in different directions will just make you completely floored with vertigo, let alone nausea. You know, nausea is a symptom of vertigo, but you'd be just out to the count. So yeah, this constant congestion, this pressure behind the eyes, you know, Scott Kelly, was it Scott or Mark? I always get, I'm so sorry, guys. But I get you mixed up all the time. Scott Kelly, I think, was the one that stayed up for the year, and he came back down, and his eyesight was damaged. I think it still is. It's slow reversal, but our eyeballs start to adjust because there's fluid behind it, and when it's in 0G, our lenses... I'm kind of making myself a little nauseous just talking about it because we're all just gross, squishy sacks of stuff. But space sickness is 100% a thing, and we don't know exactly what causes it, but it is prevalent among astronomers. There's also something interesting. It's kind of a tangent, but for people viewing this who might not have heard of it before, called the observer effect, which I highly recommend you look at. It's a big sort of psychological effect that happens that comes from looking down on your planet, and just it's mostly like a big existential crisis that happens and what that does to our bodies. So I agree with you, Michal, in your reaction of just fluid sacks. So from that, but I love the fact that they tie that to the inertial dampeners. Like, the doctor's like, God, this is like my fourth, at the time, at the beginning of the episode, he's like, this is my fourth time dealing with space sickness. He's like, maybe the inertial dampeners are out. So this idea that the inertial dampeners are slightly offline, meaning that it's not compensating for the ship's motion, that you are getting a little residual stuff that you would pick up on, not super consciously, but your body would pick up on. Yeah, exactly. I love that. So, the pesky swelling. But the inertial dampeners having at least some fluctuation would be slightly off. So that's sort of the first clue that things are getting weird. Then they start to notice, well, they're playing ping pong, and like the ping pong ball like freezes midair. So something's up. Sorry, I've been talking for like 3 hours, so my throat's a little bit exhausted. But they're playing ping pong, and the ping pong ball freezes, and so they're like, oh, something's wrong here. And they're realizing that there are space-time fractures all throughout the ship, starting where this weapon was. I think it's like Deck 4, Section 29? I think I got that? I did write it down. I think I got that right. Janeway's trying to use force fields to like contain these temporal fractures that are happening, and then Chakotay like coming down through her ready room, like boom, boom, like you got like 4 visions of them in one event. And so at this point they realize there are time fractures. And one of the things I love is that Janeway basically goes to the doctor. He's like, I've got 37 space sickness things. And I was wondering how time travel, like some temporal distortion, could cause space sickness. And the way I was thinking about it is not so much the inertial dampeners, because that's very much motion, but the vertigo that you get instead from having your anticipation be sucked out from under you. So, for example, going for an extra step when there isn't one. That's kind of the analogy that I give for this temporal distortion making you sick to your stomach. That time is slightly off, so your body, it's a totally subconscious thing, but it's just surprising you enough, especially as you're moving throughout a ship with you're experiencing time throughout, that you would be like constantly feeling that going for that extra step that's not there. That pit in your stomach that you get is just like this latent thing from a background offset of time. A mind in motion, as you were. I like that. That's awesome. Your mind is expecting, because that's always something we talk about when we talk about time being this fourth dimension, that we experience it at 1 second per second, and we are attuned to that. We exist within it, and we don't know how to control it. But our bodies are so used to that, in the same way that inertia is the concept that a body in motion wants to stay in motion, a mind in motion at 1 second per second, if there is any offset from that, would make you sick. So I kind of love this. It's such a tiny little detail, but I kind of love this idea that there's a sense of time inertia, right? That our bodies, an object, a human, a person moving forward at once, existing, I guess, at 1 second per second, would feel somehow a temporal distortion, and it would manifest itself in nausea, which is awesome. Oh, thanks, Nerd Trek Podcast. Yay. So brilliant. I kind of love that, and I think that definitely deserved a follow. So I really appreciate that. That you're all just out of sync in this. I'm writing this down. It's temporal inertia. It's brilliant. And I didn't have that written down. I just said to talk about time travel giving us space sickness. So that is awesome. But I'm glad you all seem to concur. So that's great. And thank you again. I appreciate it. So we have this. Everyone's getting sick. They figured out that there are time fractures throughout the ship. They still can't get a lock on this weapon, trying to figure out what it is. And now they're still jumping around, and Janeway goes back to the deck 4 where this all started and notices, or she doesn't go back, she's doing sensor readings on deck 4, and she notices the chronoton flux of 0.003. So, before we carry on, I'll get the comments here so I can read them. Neelix's message before it was sent. Like, they're so close to each other, why doesn't the ship rend itself apart? And how can Janeway see a distortion in Chakotay without him dying? Yes. I'll answer that in a second. And then what if it's the slight time difference of being in orbit that causes space sickness? Oh, Andy, I really like that. That's awesome. So that's the idea that the International Space Station is slightly out of Earth's, like slightly further out of Earth's gravitational well than we are here on the surface. So maybe that's what's causing the unknown space sickness that astronauts experience. I pass that down as like a hard, low probability, but not ruled out, because it is tiny. I mean, they're in low Earth orbit, and even in GEO, which is tens of thousands of kilometers away, they experience, like, it's fractions of nanoseconds. So it's even less than that at the International Space Station. But, I mean, we don't know what chronotons, how that affects. So 0.003 is obviously messing everything up. So maybe it is. I kind of appreciate that. So it might be. I think there's a few more zeros there. But I like that. Okay, so to Becca's question about how the Doctor could receive Neelix's message, because this is how they're starting to figure out that there are temporal things, is essentially the Doctor's in there treating the few cases of space sickness. They still don't know what it is. They think it's the inertial dampeners. Gets a buzz from Neelix and goes that someone has fallen ill. He goes to the mess hall, and then Neelix is like, what are you doing here? And he's like, you just called me. He's like, no, I didn't. And he's like, you told me that person is fallen ill. And then we see that person like passed out on their table with space sickness. So they are like 8 minutes behind? Like the mess hall is 8 minutes behind the medical bay. I mean, there's a whole... So we've talked about this a little bit in Star Trek, the fact that cause and effect is going to break your brain real fast here, and that tachyons are a indicator of time travel purely because of the breakdown of cause and effect. And that's effectively what's going on. Temporal fractures are going to screw up our innate understanding of cause and effect. So it's this idea that the fact that you asked that question and the fact that we have a hard time wrapping our head around is exactly why we can't find tachyons, and it's so hard for us to understand time travel. is because our entire understanding of how we communicate, exist, do stuff in our universe is predicated on cause and effect. And the fastest anything can be communicated is the speed of light. There's a whole quantum entanglement thing that we're still trying to understand, but that's kind of a base understanding there. So it's so I'm kind of like, you responded magic. It's kind of like that, but I think it's just more along the lines of like, we just can't understand it because it's a temporal fracture, which just breaks cause and effect. So, and yeah, podcast, like I Nerd Trek podcast. Sorry, I shortened that. But they do great time travel episodes. I think they really close the loop pretty well on those, and it's fabulous. But as Becca was saying too, this idea that Chakotay was like existing simultaneously from Janeway's perspective, it was because there was a fracture observing. So she's like looking across. So that one I'm more okay with understanding. And yeah, the way that I'm viewing that is essentially the idea that when you, like, I'm thinking refraction is essentially where I'm trying to go with this. That if you have an object below the water, and you are outside of the water trying to view it, that barrier, that's like that temporal fracture that's happening in Janeway's ready room. And viewing past it, Chakotay and an object that's on the other side, that's under the water, for example, is still fine. They're continuing to exist. But it's that barrier that's screwing up your ability to see exactly where it is or to see how big it is necessarily. And you can see multiple, especially if you're at the right angle, you can see multiple images of it in the same way that Janeway did. So that one I'm kind of more okay with understanding how it, because we were just seeing it from Janeway's side of the temporal fracture, whereas like Chakotay didn't seem to notice anything. But let's be honest, he's not the most... Sorry, Becca. I know you like Chakotay. I was just about to say, it's not the most observant person in the world. We're good. We love you, Chakotay. But yeah, like, so I would say that image was refraction as opposed to just this cause and effect melange of nightmares that we dealt with the mess hall thing. So I love fandoms. We all just, I mean, I will get into that level of defending if we start poking on other people. So I appreciate that. But yeah, so, but you did ask like how it can physically do damage, and it does. Like the thing is that it cascades. I think that's what they're trying to explain when we're in I call it the ping pong era, as we're jumping around, right? Instead of just throwing out star dates. The ping pong competition, our current era, that's the one that fractures so badly that the ship tears itself apart. And kind of like in Cause and Effect, where they're living the same time over and over again right before it breaks, that's like the key in the timeline that they have to keep going back to. That's where they've yanked 7 out of multiple times to try to find this weapon, because the weapon is causing cascading issues, and and those so when I say cascading, I mean like positive exponential, issues that are happening. It's just getting worse, and because it's getting worse, and this weapon, whatever it is causing it, but we still aren't able to get a hold of it. So they yank 7 out. A microsecond before the explosion, but it did seem to be a little bit longer than that because she wasn't anywhere near the escape pods. But I think that they were more just saying that it's got to be at least a microsecond before the explosion is kind of how I interpreted that. And we'll let that one go. But I just wrote down in my notes, the time cops grabbed 7. Our good friends, the time cops. They're on the Federation ship Relativity 500 years later. This was something that was really interesting. They really do. They have a flair for the dramatic. So I was curious. I was like, why are they... The destruction of Voyager must be so disruptive to the timeline in a way that we don't appreciate now, because we are watching its destruction. We are up to that point in Voyager's story, so we don't know the rest of Voyager's story. but the destruction of Voyager must be so consequential to the overall timeline that they have to go back and prevent that from happening, which is kind of sweet and special. That they have to do that because Voyager is special. It's my special baby and I love it. But they do say, and this was what was weird for me, that the ocular implant that Seven has, the Borg implant, detects distortions in space-time better than their sensors. They are time cops from 500 years in the future who specialize in time travel. I would think that they would have a better way of detecting distortions in space-time, but in the end, I'm always going to be subjective when it comes to Voyager. But I would think that they would be a little bit better than Borg's technology. But who am I to say? Who am I to say? It's just that they can see it through. It's Borg. Exactly. It's Borg. They do mention they've already recruited her twice. She asks the same questions every time, which I kind of love. My little Seven is so concerned with the same things every single time. They've narrowed it down to a 2-year time frame. So we assume that first one that they did, and I see I'll get to the question in a second. We assume that the first one they did was the one that we opened the show with in the dry dock that then failed, right? She had to go back and then she collapsed. Now they're attempting it again. And so they did see the weapon. This is where it starts to get a little bit tricky. They did see the weapon in the dry dock, but they've narrowed down the placement of the weapon to a 2-year time frame. And this is where it starts to hurt a little bit, but you just have to remember, kind of like what we were doing with the Avengers, if anyone hung in that long, think about the fact that, like, the Infinity Stones that went back after having gone through the whole journey are in a different timeline. Even though they still exist where they are, they have aged a certain amount. And that's kind of the same thing here, that this weapon is jumping all over the timeline, but it is aging further than where Seven is in her timeline trying to track it. So it showed up on the ship at one point, and then the actions are going to eventually move it. I'm sorry, trying to do it reverse. It's actually going to move it back to a previous timeline that Seven is then, she showed up too early, that she has to then go through those same motions so she matches up with it, if that makes sense. That's a little bit of a headache there, but it works. And yes, exactly. Thank you. You know what, Nerd Trick? If you want to go down that line of, like, what Seven did on Picard being necessary and why they had to do it, I'm happy to stick with that. And there's also some important events that happen at the end of Voyager that I think they have to maintain as well. So, but I do kind of like it. And, yeah, Mikhail mentioned Jack Harkness. That's so right. Billy, very funny. But this is a whole paradox with time travel, right? We call it time's arrow for a reason. We call entropy time's arrow for a reason, because everything ages. Everything gets more and more disordered as you go. So think about that. What they're tracking is not so much when Seven at the opening of the episode is, like, way back in time. She tries to disarm the bomb and, like, can't because it exists in a different time frame. It has higher entropy than she does because she has to go through all those time jumps to catch up to where that weapon's entropy is before she can interact with it. If that kind of makes sense? I think that kind of makes sense. Billy, we've solved, like, temporal inertia. We've got time streams and entropy. This is fabulous. I love it. So it's great. It's solid. This is a solid episode. This also, we have caught back up. They throw out the Dolly paradox where time starts to warp and slow down, and it's the best. We can do so many time jokes here. They also talk about the causality loop, and they specifically call out first contact, which is brilliant. And they say, like, the actions of the Borg going back in time caused the Enterprise to go back in time to help Zefram Cochrane and maintain the timeline. So in that sense, they closed the causality loop, because even though the cause and effects changed that caused Zefram Cochrane to launch, he still did launch. So the timeline closed itself very neatly. And yeah, exactly like Time's Arrow, that Data's head aged over those years, and I love it. You guys are the best. Now we formally kind of meet Braxton along this stage, but they pulled Seven from the ping pong era out, and they're like, we need you. You've traveled too much. We keep trying to grab you, and we can't, and we keep breaking you. And Braxton, he's like, we're going to send you back to a specific time before Seven joined Voyager, but when the Kazons were attacking and you're in the Delta Quadrant. So we are going to call that the Kazon era. So we have the ping pong era, the Kazon era, and the dry dock era. You with me? Okay, good. When he's sending her to the Kazon era, he basically says, look out for the Janeway factor. There are 3 major incursions to a timeline because of Captain Janeway, and we call it the Janeway factor. And she dumped me in LA for 3 decades. He didn't say LA, but he dumped me in the 20th century for 3 decades. And curse you, Janeway, the Janeway factor. And we love it. So she does get sent back to the Kazon attack. They detect a .003 chronoton flux in the timeline. There's no sign of the weapon here. Okay, so we're starting to narrow down on when it's placed. Because remember, we have to have the entropy, the timeline match up. They have to meet at the same point. Because we had Seven at the dry dock, Seven is now wandering around still as a lower decks ensign, and Janeway recognizes her. There's the .003 chronoton flux, and then there's this person on the ship that she recognizes, and demands to know what's demands. She's just like, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? What are you doing here? You're going to tell me. You're going to tell me. I'm not leaving until you tell me. You need to tell me so we can fix this. Tell me, please. I want to know. I want to know. What's going on? That's the Janeway factor. She just does not give up, which is why we love her. So she is an ultimate timeline troll. Picard maneuver, Janeway factor, absolutely. Janeway and Kirk, man, quite the pair. So the chronotons are always in that spot no matter where Voyager is. Okay, so we're going to come up back to why that chronoton flux exists. And it is essentially because we've touched all those points in time. But we'll come back to that. Now, there is no sign of weapon. Janeway will Janeway, and she was relentless. And genuinely, when Seven is like, look, I will join your ship. This is what you're going to tell me. I have been sent back in time to save this ship. I am here to help you. Please trust me. Please help me figure this out. Janeway's like, all right, let's do it. She's like super down for it. And it's fabulous. It's fabulous. And so, when in doubt, man, pull Janeway into your time travel schemes. She will help you more than she will hurt you. She will hurt Braxton more than she will help him. But who cares? He's fine. Now, she kind of... And I love, Andy was like, yeah, Janeway's so hard in this episode. She does... I mean, her eye rolls are on point in this episode. And Janeway eye rolls are possibly my favorite things in a great way. And it is true, Becca. Like, it is such a great testament to their friendship, and I think it just speaks to that personalities meshing, where she's like, look, you told me these things. I trust you. I'm asking you to trust me. And Janeway implicitly does that, which I love, and it's fabulous. Now, because they do that, they are able to get into the Deck 4 section 20-something, and it's Braxton. Braxton's planting the bomb. And it turns out it's super future Braxton, but Janeway doesn't even know. She hasn't got him stuck in the 20th century yet. And once Seven is like, it's Braxton in here. The guy on this, the lieutenant on the time lieutenant, he's like, you're under arrest, dude. And it's such a Minority Report thing. He's like, you're under arrest for stuff you haven't done yet. And I'm going to help take care of this. And she is such a willing participant for possibly hating it. I think she secretly loves it. We know she secretly loves it. So they jump back then. Now, now we have the future Braxton, who's causing all these problems. He is in the Jeffries tube. He's busted, and he nopes out of there super fast and goes to 2 years earlier. So now Seven is starting to because she caught him when he was trying to plant the bomb. She's now caught up in that time stream as well. So then she goes back to the dry dock era. Then jumps again 5 years ahead, right before the accident, when the ping pong ball froze the first time. But now the entropies have all matched up, so they're catching up with each of all of them. So they're able to touch, handle, and prevent this all from happening. They see all of it. They see all of it. Everything happens. Call it the dry dock, the Kazon battle, and the ping pong. And Seven, the normal Seven, who isn't time traveling, apprehends Braxton. Janeway gets beamed out of there to the time ship. And I'll answer this before. Could Braxton have changed because he knows about it now, or is that part of the loop and he's bound to do it anyway? That's one of the interesting questions, right? Is it's like, again, we will end up just crying into a drink if we try to break the logic down too much. But the question is, like, how much of a cause and effect thing happened? And it really goes to how much they close the timeline here. And the implication is that once they close the timeline, they merge. Whatever that is. Because they're like, yeah, we have 3 Braxtons on the ships now, and it'll all be fine. So Janeway gets drafted in, literally gets drafted, to take care of this nonsense now. She eye rolls the crap out of it. Just full Janeway eye roll. And they send her back to the Kazon attack. She is Jane. If you're looking for a great Janeway episode, this is a fabulous one, just even for this scene in its own. He basically fesses up with the time cops and says, hey, I'm gonna stumble over when I get there, and that's the time to get me. Please don't be too mad at me. And so she gets him. She brings him back. They're all in one place, and they're like, okay, we gotta go fix the timeline. And they do their time copy thing, and then they're like, okay, it's only a 0.0036 incursion factor. Now, they didn't round up, but that's a similar number. So I think, personally, that the reason 0.003 chronoton flux keeps showing up is that latent repairing of the timeline that's going on. That's as good as time is going to get because of all this nonsense that's going on. So there's an incursion factor of 0.0036, and their parting words to Janeway were, please try to avoid time travel. Which is poetry for the rest of Voyager. But on that note, we have 20 minutes left to talk about Children of Time, which is actually kind of appropriate because there's not a ton of science in here, but it's a really interesting, more philosophical discussion that I really want to talk about. Get that one. Do you mean me? I'll take a coffee. But Janeway definitely needs one. I love it. So Children of Time is a awesome episode. I love this episode so much. And one of the things I appreciate is I get really, when I watch Deep Space Nine, I typically watch it all the way through. Or I'll watch a whole story arc. Just because of its serialized telling. So it's rare for me to go back and just watch a single episode, and I'm just reminded what a great... yeah, I'm having a whiskey after this. What a great show Deep Space Nine is. So they are basically on a heading home after a long-term Defiant mission. So we'll flip our Chakotay and Janeway fanning out for a second, and we gotta remember now all the Deep Space Nine characters, and we'll start geeking out over those. Oh, I have hearts in this episode on my notes. But they pass by they're getting strange signals from a nearby solar system, and they detect an energy barrier around the 4th planet. They think there might be life forms there, and they're wondering if they've adapted to the quantum fluctuations in this barrier that's around this planet. The interference that's going on, whatever this barrier is getting worse, and they're not even going to be able to access the surface of the planet after a few weeks. So everyone is like, I want to go home. And Jadzia Dax is kind of science geeking all over it. She's like, we got to check. It looks weird. I want to learn about it. And it's like, she's probably not the most popular person there for a while. Just saying. Which is interesting. I do want to come back when we talk about later on. This idea of the guilt that, oh, thank you. Here, I'll throw that emote in there for everyone. So they basically mod the shields. They jump through the interference. Those are all sort of my odd notes here. They do find scattered settlements of about 8,000 humans, at which point they all just... and everyone there is like, what's up, buddies? I know you, and I know you, and I know you, and we're all your descendants. We have all your DNA in us. You crashed here 2 centuries ago, and now we all exist here. Great kickoff to a time travel episode. I freaking love this one. I love it so much. So they detect this Dax symbiont. This guy Yedrin contains the Dax symbiont, and there's an O'Brien running around. They detect O'Brien's DNA in one of the descendants, so they're like, oh yeah, that's true. So essentially what's happened is they've landed on this planet. They're going to try to escape. They're going to hit the barrier. The barrier is going to fling them back down, and they're going to crash on the planet, but it also flings them back in time. And so they crash 200 years prior. Then they've been making babies, and they civilize. They create a civilization there, and 2 centuries pass, and then those descendants now know when that initial approach is going to happen, because then they're going to go up and they're going to crash and they're going to be flung back in time. So it's a pretty tight time travel loop that's happening here. Problem is, the Defiant doesn't want to crash and die. O'Brien wants to get back and see his family. Kira is going to die. They basically say, they're like, yeah, she dies in the crash, and everyone else survives. And yeah. There are some great, we call them awarfable moments in this episode. I love the Klingons. Some are Klingons by DNA, some are Klingons by choice. And I think a lot of us Star Trek fans can relate to that. But those Klingons show up and they're like this revered, kind of feared warrior race. And it is just fabulous. But this really becomes like a more deep, intense psychological discussion than a scientific one, really. That they'll try to leave, but it really comes down to more of a time travel thing of like, how much is actually predetermined? As they're there making all these choices, that would have theoretically happened initially. So how much are they trying to get out of it by saying, okay, well, we could try this option or we could try this option? How much are they still going to end up crashed and back on the planet? That's kind of the first big question that kept running through my mind, especially before we find out that Yedrin had faked their logs. Initially, what he had done is Yedrin Dax, so he's got the Dax symbiont. Initially, he was like, well, we did, that thing that hit Kira, that damaged her. There was he said that there was a quantum duplicate that was created, briefly. But you can utilize that to fly your ship out, and then when you hit the barrier, you create a quantum duplicate, so one will fly out and one will crash down, and then all the timelines will be preserved and everything will be fine. But they do find out after the fact that he did make that up, and which is intense, by the way. But that got me thinking, like, would they, all their attempts, let's say that the quantum thing happened anyway, right? Let's say that it wasn't a fake logs, that they were trying to create this quantum duplicate. They were only doing it because Yedrin mentioned that they had that in there. Would that still have caused them to crash? And is that the inciting incident for them to crash in the first place? Maybe it wasn't the fact that they passed straight on through normally. It was this idea that they had to crash, but then they had to crash anyway. It's bonkers. It's just crazy. Yeah, science is gone. But could the Heisenberg compensator have helped here? If we were sticking with the quantum duplicate thing, possibly. But the issue is that we have this barrier here that is not going to let the ship pass necessarily. They're trying to get through these fluctuations that are starting to intensify, whatever they are. There's not, like I said, not a ton of science being explained here, but it's more the philosophical aspect of the time travel and the cause and effect that we've been discussing, this whole times arrow thing, that you'd have to have an initial timeline, right, where they came through, tried to leave, crashed, have the descendants, then they come through again and the descendants talk to them. But there wouldn't have been any descendants there the first time that they came through. So it's all these little nuances about how cause and effect happens, and at what point are you condemning yourself to the same fate? Like, what timeline are you actually living in? Because the other part about that too, with that quantum duplicate, was essentially saying, like, well, how do you know, right? If your ship crashed and you were not having those faked logs, but you were passing through there, how do you know that that other ship crashed? Or if you're the ship that crashed, that another one made it through? And that's where I suspect, from a writing standpoint, the writers changed it to have the logs be faked. Because otherwise, we are going to have to, kind of in that, like, the Voyager episode with the cloned ship, the kind of dark one, right? We kind of have to keep living with that, right? This idea that there was a Kira that died. There was an entire abandoned O'Brien who never got to see his kids again. Like, all of those, Brett, exactly, those fixed moments in time that need to happen. And it's just a really kind of fascinating question that this episode asks that I really like. And so are you going to be able, and I think time travel does handle this really well, writ large, across most of science fiction. This idea that, do you have any say in what happens? That if you go back in time to change time, a predestination paradox, right? That you have to do it because that is what causes the timeline that you have now. So it's all fascinating. But let's take a pause from that deep kind of existential discussion to talk about Kira and Odo. Because if Becca got to fan about Chakotay, I'm going to fan about Kira and Odo. I already cashed in my Janeway fanning for the day, but that's my hearts, my Kira and Odo hearts. I did not ship the two of them, and I know this is supposed to be science talk, but real quick. Odo basically, when they get to the planet in the main characters that we're following, Odo has to stay in his liquid state because of the quantum fluctuations that are happening around the planet. Whatever that is. Now, we can break that down a little bit. That Odo's, he's got this physiology that essentially allows him to take shape, but his default state is existing as a sort of liquid form. And holding a physical shape takes effort. This is long established in Deep Space Nine, that he has to physically hold a shape that he can only do for so long. And so, taking the idea that there are quantum fluctuations, and let's just run with the quantum thing, right? Usually we're just like, all right, just technobabble, whatever. But let's say that they're really talking quantum. That's down at the subatomic level. That would be difficult for Odo to maintain the, essentially, molecules, right? At a subatomic level, to maintain a molecule structure to keep a solid form. So that actually kind of works. It kind of works in the way that they described it. We don't need to science it anymore, but just the fact that they were saying that the quantum fluctuations around the planet prevented Odo from maintaining his physical state. And yet, that Odo that crashed on the planet was able over time to adapt to those quantum fluctuations and maintain a physical form. Not just maintain a physical form, but actually get better at imitating a human form. And I really like that. I think that that's a that makes sense in the way that we've discussed Odo's shape-shifting abilities and these, whatever these quantum fluctuations are, quantum being a subatomic subspace type thing. It kind of works, and I kind of love that. So it's just important to bear in mind here that of all the descendants that are multi-generations, hundreds of years, 200 years have passed, that Dax, the symbiont, which carries memories, and Odo are the two original beings that have carried all of that on. So, is that like H.G. Wells' Time Machine? He created the machine to save his fiancée, but then can't save her because they need that's exactly it, right? That, and what caused him to make the time machine in the first place? If he's going back to correct it, then he's never going to make the machine. And we see this a lot in science fiction, and it works. And that's kind of the same storytelling that they're doing here. And that's where Kira's crisis sets in. And I think a lot of us have a back and forth relationship with Kira. I do really like her. I think she's an interesting character. I think I appreciate her more now than I used to. But she kind of, if you love her or hate her, you're going to love her or hate her in this episode. Because she basically comes to terms with her own death. And she had this whole thing with Shakar. Please. Shakar. Where she was told by the prophets that that was not her destiny. And then immediately afterwards, she finds herself dead, finding out that she's about to die on this planet. And she kind of comes to terms with that. Shakar. I swear. But then the thing, and like I said, if you love her or hate her, you're gonna be polarized with this. She basically is just like, look, it's all of our destiny. I'm okay dying. The rest of you have to be okay with this. Because if I'm okay dying, the rest of you have to be okay with this. Because I'm facing my worst timeline. Which I personally think kind of sucks. Because, I just want O'Brien to be able to go back and see his kids. But that being said, I think it is true to Kira's character. So fundamentally, I'm not angry about it. I think it's interesting. I think that of all the characters, it makes the most sense for her to be the one who's like, we have to face our fate. We have to hit that barrier and crash and come to terms with the fact that we are no longer going to see our family. And this barrier, remember, is getting harder to pass through. So what they do is they're all like, fine, Kira, you're right. Whatever, I guess. Fine. And they record messages to their family to send through the barrier that they're not going to be able to penetrate later because it's hardening. So they're going to send all these messages through. And then, but the other big thing that I love that I want to fangirl about before we finish the episode is that Odo tells Kira that he loves her. Because as much as I have mixed feelings about Kira as a character, I, over the course of Deep Space Nine, ended up being a hardcore Kira Odo shipper. So I do have Kira plus Odo surrounded in little hearts in my notebook because I was so excited about that. So old Odo tells Kira, he's like, I just wanted to see you because you died and I never got to say goodbye, and I want you to know that I've always loved you. It's so cute. I love him so much. It's just amazing. But then Kira's still okay with dying. Ugh. And it's pretty frustrating. And then they find out, they find out that Yedrin faked his logs and wants to ensure their survival. Kira basically is like, this is my destiny. And so everyone else on the ship is like, well, I guess we have to die now, which sucks. Not die, but I guess we have to accept our fate now. They send their recordings. And then as they're taking off, as they're leaving, being like super sucks, but just maintaining their timeline, they pass right through. And someone had altered their path. And the settlement has disappeared. Which is kind of like, even saying that right now, I kind of got a pit in my stomach. Because it really is, it is pretty brutal. And they all disappeared. That adorable Quark math teacher disappeared. That was my favorite. But yeah, yeah, Brad, I know. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, Team Kira all the way, but you're right, though. Nerd Trek Podcast. I can't wait on my Trek brunch on Sundays. I can't wait to do a full Deep Space Nine rewatch with Samantha, who's never seen it before. She doesn't watch these for spoilers, so. And you're gonna watch my love for Kira and Odo unfold in real time. But yeah, so just to wrap things up, they basically pass through. The messages still exist after the settlement disappeared. It's because our initial timeline created them. It wasn't that they were taking the messages from the people who went through the other timeline. It was, we have our one who's only experienced a couple days. So they've gone, they've made the messages, they left. Those messages still exist. And as poetically as Sisko says at the end of it, he's like, it's not that they've disappeared. They will live on in our mind. We just erased them from the face of the planet, but their memory lives on. And that's an interesting take to the time paradox thing that I think we see utilized differently in Star Trek. That some time travel Star Trek episodes, I know we've done recently. Maybe not that one, but where the memories are completely erased, right? When they jump to another, like Seven, right? When they jump to another period in time, they don't remember any of that time travel. When timelines changed, it all gets erased. So that's idea of like, if they were taking that path, cause and effect, thank you. If they were taking that path, that would be like, they went, looked at the planet, left, and immediately forgot everything that was there. That'd be a pretty intense ending. So I don't blame the writers for kind of picking and choosing based on the emotional beat that you want to hit with that, because that can be brutal. That can be brutal and sometimes unnecessary for the type of story you're trying to tell. And so I think for this type of story, you want them to be memorialized in some way. So maintaining those memories kind of by default says that those messages would also be maintained. They think that it was Yedrin Dax, and I kind of ran out of time a little bit, but just briefly, I'm headcanoning this a little bit because this episode is really good, that Jadzia's at fault for all of this. Oh, yeah. Then it turns out to be Odo. But first, they think it's Yedrin. They think that Yedrin did it. And the reason they think Yedrin did it, I think, because I thought about it for a while, but Jadzia Dax was responsible for the entire thing. And it is kind of a catch-22, Sophie's Choice, no good solution to this. That either they're going to kill the entire civilization or Kira's going to die and they're going to be stuck on this planet forever. There's no good answer to that. And I felt when they say, oh, it must have been Yedrin, maybe he had a change of heart. I immediately thought that maybe that was the Dax symbiont who was just like, I'm seeing my friends again. I want them to have this life. Let's let them be free, because the Dax is carrying that guilt for all those years of what happened. Because she was the one that said, let's check it out. Everyone else wanted to go home. Dax is the one who convinced them it would be okay and sent them there. So it's kind of brutal, but it's kind of good. Then, indeed, it does end up being Odo because he loves Kira and they're the best couple and they should stay together forever. But yeah, it did end up being Odo who altered the path. And Sisko at the end said they existed as long as we remember them. So, I'm sorry, Billy. It's a great... This is one of those where Star Trek... One of the reasons we do this episode club is to pick out these ones that are sort of scientific, but have similar themes at its very core. And we've pulled out a lot of time travel episodes lately, which I really appreciate. I think that they're really good episodes. I do have an emote for Billy right now. But they utilize these themes to different effects. And I think that the way that they did it here was a very effective method of storytelling, about your destiny and about your ability to control your own timeline and to allow fate to play out. And like I said earlier, I think that's why the writers stepped away from the quantum duplicate thing. I do suspect, because it seems like such an obvious explanation, a way to preserve all the timelines happily and not have it be a super tragic episode. I suspect that early on in the development, that was an idea, and then they were like, there's no way to prove it all worked. Like, there's, you're gonna have your people escape, and then how, but you still had Kira die there, and so there's no easy way to explain it. So the storytelling that they do in this episode, I think, is really strong, and I appreciate that. The science in Relativity, I love it. Jumping all over the timeline is fabulous. It's a good headache. Our brains are getting stronger. Anyway, I ate my couple minutes over. Thank you all for hanging out with me. I really, really appreciate this. I hope you had a good time. It was very, very fun. Yeah, we're going to have a great time. Oh my gosh, thank you. No, it's PDT? Is it starting right now? Go do that. There's a Voyager reunion that's just starting. So go, be free, have fun. All right, run. Go do that. Look it up. Robert Picardo's running it. I don't have a link in it right now. I love you all. Live long and prosper. Until next time. I'll see you guys. Thank you.